Okay, we are up to the second of Purim relating to carrying on Shabbos and establishing an Eruv. Exciting topics which many of us don't really know much about because we don't make the Eruvs, we don't check the Eruvs, but this is something that is very lamaisa in most of our communities around the world today. There is an Eruv and want us to know that it's not just you're allowed to carry and do anything you want. There are Yesodos, which obviously we're not going to get too far into. One would require numerous shiurim to learn all the Yesodos of Eruvin, but we're getting a little idea. We learned last week. Again, this is the Tzurba M'Rabanan shiurim volume number 22. This is we'll be starting on page 298. It's the Dr. Harold and Magda Katz volume, and we continue now in the second shiur relating to Eruv. So we spoke last week about the definition of Rishuyos on Shabbos. There is Rishus HaRabim, Rishus HaYachid, Carmelis, and Makom Ptur. And we learned the ABCs, the Yesod of building an Eruv is the area which I want to enclose has to be a Rishus HaYachid Daraisa. Meaning if it's a Rishus HaRabim, so then you can't build an Eruv around it. That's the given. So that's the issue about building Eruvs. Number two is once it's a Rishus HaRabim D'Rabbanan only, you can build an Eruv, then you have to know about the issues about building the Eruv. But again, that's step number one. So that's what we spoke about different days, about what makes something a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa. We mentioned there's a Machlokes Rishonim about 600,000 people. Rashi mentions it, Tosfos mentions it. Other Rishonim don't mention it. The Rambam doesn't mention it. That's a big kula. You need 600,000 people in one place at one time. We mentioned the Rashi. The Rashi says you need a straight mishar l'shar. Maybe it has to be one long straight street. Again, also 16 amos wide and not roofed. We discussed, what about if you have a gate that can be closed? Does it have to be no'ul balayla? What if once in a while? So that was all issues that we spoke about gates affecting the public domain. So we are up to page 298. Interesting and various inyanim having to do with Eruvin. So first we discuss here challenges of city Eruvin, and a number of examples are given here. First, the Achiezer of Chaim Ozer. Chaim Ozer discusses in the 1930s the Eruv in Paris. The Eruv in Paris, they asked him, and Paris already had 600,000 people. So the question was, can there build an Eruv? So after consulting with a Chazon Ish, the Achiezer of Chaim Ozer said, since Paris was surrounded at that time by 3 halachic walls anyway, if you have water, if you have walls, if you have areas, man-made river banks and other structures, therefore it was not called a Rishus HaRabim in his opinion, and therefore an Eruv could be built. In 31, not Torah, there are 3 mechitzas, b'chol shalosh ruchos. The Gambaruch Revius Yish Mechitza Berach Shlish, and even the fourth side, and therefore Imkin Lefiza Ain Lo Ir Paris De Rishus HaRabim Ben Torah. It's not a Rishus HaRabim D'Oraisa. The Agam Sheisham Harbe Pirtzas. There are many breaks. There's bridges. Aidei Gesharim. Mikol Makom Ein Hein Osos Ben Torah. That's only a Psul D'Oraisa D'Rabbanan, not a D'Oraisa, because Omid Meruba Al Haparitz is only a D'Rabbanan problem of Pirza, Yoser, Me'eser, Amos, and therefore you can fix that with the Tzuras HaPesach. That's Rav Chaim Ozer about the Paris Eruv. If you look in the article in the journal Noam, in the next source, of Shlomo David Kahana, in source 32, talks about the Warsaw Eruv. The Warsaw Eruv. Also, Warsaw had a population of less than 600,000, but then it grew. And then it grew. So does that make it into Rosh Hashanah and Daraisa? So Rav Shlomo David Kahana bases it on the Rashi that we just mentioned. We had Rashi earlier. Al da'ashe laso im ba'ayaros hagadolos srichan lachers Rosh Hashanah Daraisa. You have to be nervous about Rosh Hashanah Daraisa, which then would prevent any Eruv being built. Shalo yehi heta l'taken atilta rakbet lasos. You would need doors. L'daiti ba'ayaros ketanos shederach hamelach overes bo ufulish me'ever el ever. If there is, ironically, if you have smaller cities, but there's a street that goes straight through, that would be a problem. But, says the Rav Shlomo David Kahana, Yeheter shal einu mafulish muskam v'niskabeld, v'lo re'inu misha cholik al zeh. The heter of einu mafulish, right? That was the Rashi we had earlier. Rashi back in source number 12. Rashi says in Erev in Davav, Mechuvan mishar l'shar shihei mafulish dome l'digle midbar. Right, straight through. So you don't have that. You don't have any of the streets like that in Warsaw, and therefore it says Rav Shlomo David Kahana, one could build in Eruv there. Not everyone agrees to this. Rav Moshe Feinstein doesn't agree to this kula. But first, the other cities, St. Louis, if you have on the bottom of 299, Rav Bechhofer wrote one of the Sfarim on modern Sfarim on Eruvin, says that the first attempt to build an Eruv in North America was in St. Louis in the 1890s by Rav Zachariah Rosenfeld, who was the chief rabbi of St. Louis, and they tried, but it didn't. He was nifter before he was successful, but he did write a pamphlet. He wrote a pamphlet called the Tikva Zachariah, the hope of Zachariah, that he hopes to build this Eruv. And he writes there, what about telephone poles? Telephone poles. Can you use telephone poles for a Tzurba Pesach? So he writes there, Kaza b'pshitus, sha'amude v'chute ha-telegraph, nechshavim Tzurba Pesach. Again, we're going to get to. It has to be where the strings are on top. That's a Tzurba Pesach. It can't be where the strings are on the side of the telephone pole, as many have. But if it's on top, like some of them do, that would be a Tzurba Pesach. You don't need lishma when it comes to Tzurba Pesach. Umistavrim let their every year. Ubishuvas Torah's Chesed Herech. He quotes Umichshash Nikar Shno Naslo She Pesach. Maybe it wasn't made to be a doorway, right? At Tzurba Pesach, the strings and the two poles is meant to be an imaginary doorway, so to speak. So he says, who says these weren't made to be to walk through? Masha Heklish, telegraph, Ma'asa Vitzuraso Mochachas Alav, Shalon Asal Shem Pesach. It wasn't made to be a Pesach. I think otherwise, says the Tikva Zachariah. Why do you think they don't put telephone poles in the middle of the street? They put it in and on the side so you can walk between them. And that's why they put the string so high. The Yamudim omdim b'chalzavis v'yamabos is on the corners. There's nothing in the middle of the street because you don't want to prevent people from walking. So obviously it was meant to walk through. So it was made to walk through, and therefore he thinks theoretically that you can use the telephone poles. But again, it has to fill all the other conditions. Manhattan was a huge issue. One of the most debated locations. Manhattan obviously has more than 600,000 people, and more than that amount traverse the streets daily. And there are a number of bridges and tunnels. So what do you do? So if you look in the contemporary Eruv, the quote there in source number 35, on page 301, Rebbe Chafer says, quotes the Machlokas HaPoskim. So first he quotes the Rabbi Shua Siegel, the Shurp in 1907. He poskined for the people on the Lower East Side, they could carry without strings. That itself, the Lower East Side itself, was a Rosh Hashanah. Why? He allowed them to carry in the streets on Shabbos. While many Jews of Polish and Hasidic extraction used the Lower East Side Eruv, those of Lithuanian descent generally did not rely on it. What was his heter? What walls did it? It was surrounded by walls. What walls? I don't see any walls. The Lower East Side was surrounded on three sides by the walls that front on the East River, and on the fourth side by the 3rd Avenue elevated train line. So he said that was like Tzurba Pesach. So you have an up elevated train. The Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Williamsburg bridges, however, all cross from the Lower East Side into Brooklyn and are 16 amos wide. Right? All of those bridges, they could carry enough people to consider Rosh Hashanah. The Shurp Sarav asserted they nevertheless did not disrupt the Eruv, says they are not mufulash. They don't lead straight into a street that cuts directly through to Manhattan to the other side, and therefore they could count that they all have Tzurba Pesachs on it, and it would be okay. A few decades later, it was in the beginning of the 1900s, a few decades later, though the original sources for leniency were no longer valid, a couple of other Rabbanim authorized that you can build an Eruv. Maybe you can't use the natural, but you can build an Eruv in Manhattan. Rav Kasher in the 1950s, Rav Kasher Gaon Atzum, right, he learned in Europe with all the Gedolim there, and he corresponded. So he quotes, Ir Manhattan, Mukaf because Stad of Savid Yamanaros is an island. Yesh Lagam Kemechidus is the Adam. And they also have Gidudin, they have shorelines, embankments. And what do you say here? So in this article, Ikra She'ela, he says, Hagsharim HaYotzim Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx. And Ufimash inspired the Shlosha Rabbanim. I had 3 people to research and bring back the evidence. He says, Ubatru Kol HaGsharim V'Yishlam, they all have a Tzurba Pesach. So Tzurba Pesach is only if as we know, Tzurba Pesach's around only help if there is no Rosh Hashanah D'Oraisa. So what about here? Kfarnis Baraber Rishonim. Rosh Hashanah afilu im yesh bam shisha ribo im ein sha'areha mechuvanim zeh keneged zeh. He paskins like that kula again from Rashi before. If the streets go one straight to the other, a straight Rosh Hashanah. Kemo shaya b'diglei midbar. Ein ladin Rosh Hashanah, but tonight that Eino Kaim in Manhattan. The streets don't go one straight. There you have to turn. It's diagonal, and therefore he is makel to build a Eruv in Manhattan. We call it lotamim near She'elaman and Rosh Hashanah klal, where you can have the Tzurba Pesach, and as long as you have the other elements of the walls, if you could determine that those are natural or even man-made walls, that would be allowed. But again, many do not rely just on natural. And Rav Moshe himself, who lived on the Lower East Side, questions this approach. He says, I don't think. Who says, even if Rashi sounds like it, who says that has to be straight? Open on both sides doesn't mean straight, not turning. Right, Rav Moshe says, I'm not sure if that's a requirement. And therefore, Manhattan qualifies as mefulish. Since traffic does proceed, it could go from bridge on one side to the other side. It is a Rosh Hashanah. According to the Ramban, he says it seems to be straight, but according to all the other Rishonim, not. Says Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe has many tshuvas about Eruv. Says Rav Moshe. Right, the kula of Rav Kasher, that, it's not a Rosh Hashanah Daraisa because it doesn't go straight. Who says you need that? Shemashakasav Arashi, Pilusho, Dola, Digle, Midbar, Tamua. Who says it was straight then? Rashi, he says even Rashi says Mishar Lashar. Who says that has to be straight? The Imkain Efshar Shaholich Afbo Fanakalason. Maybe even diagonally. And angles. They make a right and make a left. Ve'ena Shar Muchuvanim Nami. Who Rishus Arabim. Ubalamaydim Mapsik Be'emsa. Right, if there's a stop in the middle that the street ends, so to speak, or a dead end. And he says at the end, maybe the Ramban has it, but I'm not sure where the Ramban gets it from. But other poskim are arguing with Rav Moshe. But ultimately, the Eruv was not used by many in Manhattan at that time. You see the contemporary Eruv in the next source. Poskim of great stature disagreed with Rav Moshe. And Rav Moshe himself writes in a 1961 Shuva that he did not protest against the Rabbanim that approved of the Manhattan Eruv. In Brooklyn, he disapproved because he felt Brooklyn was worse with Ocean Parkway and others. But Rav Moshe, his effect had a big hashpah. If you look in the footnote here, that was Rav Moshe in the days of old. More recently, over the past couple of decades, the major parts of Manhattan has a new Eruv that is checked, that takes into account many of the more challenging issues that Rav Moshe has. It says in the footnote, it solves the problem of the bridges. They don't include them in the Eruv. And the 600,000 people, maybe that's only if they're in one spot at one time, which doesn't happen. So there's more there, but now the Machom Lahora of Monsey built that Eruv. He quotes in the footnotes, and there are many that would use that Eruv in the places that it is. Okay, so this is a number one, issues that come up in general with Eruvin. The next, on page 305, we have constructing a halachic entranceway. Tzuras HaPesach. There's a whole sugya of what is a good Tzuras HaPesach. Right, the Shulchan Aruch, based on the Gemara in Eruvin. Aaron, I think it's Daf Yud Aleph. The Shulchan Aruch quotes the Gemara. Ma'u Tzuras HaPesach. What is a Tzuras HaPesach? Right, Tzuras HaPesach can be used to complete a halachic partition. So the area is surrounded, let's say you have walls, and the rest, Tzuras HaPesach, so it's not a pirza, it's not a hole. It's a doorway. Tzuras HaPesach is a doorway. So what is the definition? Kanami kan v'kanami kan al gabehen. You have one vertical pole and one vertical pole, and the horizontal pole or string on top of those poles. Afilu eina nogea bahen, ela sheish b'nehem kama amos. Even if the horizontal string, pole, pipe on top is much higher than the vertical poles, it is okay. That's called good asik. That's a halacha Moshe Sinai. As long as the poles are 10 tefachim high, at least, so that's at least you have that wall, and then above it, like we have in Hilchas Sukkah as well. It's got to be right under. Right under. The vertical poles have to be right under the string. We'll get to that. The Mishnah Berurah says in 40, right under. Not even a tiny bit. Not under. You need both vertical poles directly under. If either of them are not, then it ruins the whole. It says that's not a doorway. Matam. The reason is even if you say, okay, we're going to stretch the walls imaginarily up and down. A doorway has the side lintels underneath the top one. And if they're both diagonal, you got to make the string diagonal. And therefore, Tzuras HaPesach is put, nowadays, as we know, two poles, or let's say you could use telephone poles or anything that could function as a vertical, and putting the wire on top. The Chassam Sofer notes the responsibility of Rabbanim in every community to ensure to build an Eruv. Says the Chassam Sofer, way back, right, in Europe, 41, Siman Sadi Tes, 99, says the Chassam Sofer, he talks about Roi v'nachol l'chol kahal am Yisrael, b'chol makomos moshvasehem. Everyone should l'takin mavoseim. It's not, okay, I don't hold of heirs. The Chassam Sofer says you got to build an Eruv. You got to build an Eruv. You have to make it, if it's halachically acceptable, build it and do it. Davar zeino tzarich lefnim. Olaraya, I shouldn't even have to prove it or talk about this. V'umen ha-seichel. It's logical. U'umen ha-mavur lahedya b'divrei chasal. Ha-seichel mechayiv. Logic dictates, says the Chassam Sofer. Basher Yadua, Sheshmir Yom Shabbos Kodesh, Me'asos Kol Chevetzu Asleina Mitzvahs Orish Rashios. It's such an important mitzvah that we have, Shabbos, like the Mishnah Berurah talks about in Akdamat Shabbos, that even though every mitzvah is connected another limb, 248, but there are limbs and there are limbs. And there are mitzvahs and there are mitzvahs. So we don't know which is which, but we can tell that Shabbos is one of the heart or the lungs or the brain. If somebody rejects Shabbos, this are Hotza'ah, and Hotza'ah is one of the malachas. And therefore, we have to do our best to try to help people not violate. Skipping down a little bit. Do things to prevent people from messing up. It's incumbent upon the Rav. It's on his shoulders. It's on his shoulders that people are carrying out. And he quotes a Gemara, and we have to say, Baruch Hashem, he says in the continuation, Nasan Belev Malachim Uskanim, many governments throughout the world give us reshus and allow us to build over even where governmental officials live, they allow us to make an Eruv. Milano Gadol Meirenu Pressburg. Which is a more distinguished big city as Pressburg, our city? Mitropolitan de Medinta, the greatest of the country. V'kama pamim hamelech yarum hodu v'skanav. Netzarimpo, many times the king and his officers come. Ukeisu vada medina v'chasei amaluchan esavim. They all come and nobody says anything. And we have vesaps all over and we have strings. It's okay. So therefore, the importance of building an Eruv, the Chassam Sofer has. That doesn't take away the challenges of building Eruvin, right? There are different shitas. But at the Rambam, most Eruvs nowadays wouldn't be good, right? Some Sfaradim hold like the Rambam, because the Shulchan Aruch does quote it as a day. The Rambam says it has to be mostly walls. The Rambam shita is that if the majority is enclosed with Tzurba M'Rabanan, meaning what we call the strings, rather than my solid walls, then the top, they have to have much closer poles. It can't be 10 amos wide. A lot of ours are very long. It can't be more than 10 amos wide. That's the Rambam Shita. The Rambam says in Hilchos Shabbos, Parak Tazayin, Kol Mechitza, source 42. Kol Mechitza, Sheish Ba Paras Murubala Omeid, Eina Mechitza. Any Mechitza that is mostly broken, majority broken parts, Eina Mechitza. But if it has a Tzurba Pesach around it, it's not just the whole. Even if it's longer, the string is longer than 10 amos, you're okay. As long as altogether, parutz is not maruba al ha'omed. According to the Rambam, you need walls. And that's a day in Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch was 2 days. In Shin Samach Beis, 43. Right, if you can make the strings longer than 10 amos from each other, the two poles, Ulaha Rambam, Ein Tzurba Pesach Mo'al Pirza Yosem Yeser, Elam Kain Omen Rubal Aparitz. Okay, the Rambam, you can only have those strings where the poles have 10 amos in between them if most you have walls. Okay, the Rambam, you need mostly walls in order to have, unless you have many Tzurba Pesachs. So that's what the Rambam would say. And the Mishnah Berurah says, maybe Ishlahachmir, but again, most Eruvs nowadays do not have that. So again, but according to the Rambam, so then that would be a problem. Rabbi Jachter, in the next source, quotes source 45, other issues that come up. First of all, how exact do you have to have the poles underneath the strings? Sometimes, especially sometimes in bungalow colonies, or even if not in regular cities, you put a barrel, let's say, and then way up above is going to be the string. So how exact? So many poskim, quotes from the Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Moshe Feinstein, that you just use your eyes. Just use your eyes and do your best. But other poskim said, and Rav Zalman Nechemya Goldberg, but Rabbi Blayach and Rav Schefter and Rabbi Willig all think you have to use a plumb line. It'd be exactly under. Because again, if it's not under, it's no good. So you have to be exactly under. So that's one issue one has to be careful about. Another major issue is tachov. What's tachov? Many times telephone poles have strings, the wires going into the pole. So we said it has to be on top of the pole and not on the side of the pole. But what if it's into the pole? Is that called on top? So you have more pole on top of it. That's true. But what if it goes straight through? That is a major machlokas poskim. Tachov. So Mr. Burr quotes the Pri Megadim, was not sure, and he was no telachumra. But Shlomo Kloger, the Aruch HaShulchan, the Chazon Ish, Risi Pesach, all were Mako. Reb David Feinstein said it shouldn't be used, or Shlomo Zalman said it should, and the Minhag in Eretz Yisrael is to be Mako, some quote. So that's another issue about tachov. Generally, try not to, unless it's difficult. Shas HaTchak, right before Shabbos, that's all you have. The Mishkan is Yaakov and the Chazon Ish also quote, what about sagging? You have to make sure the wire is taut. Sagging wires, if it's sagging too much, it could be an issue. If it's sagging a little bit, most say it's okay. But the common practice he quotes here in 45, there's different practices and different minhagim. What happens if chas v'shalom, the erev breaks, one of the strings snaps on Shabbos? So what do you do? So in order to prevent mass violation, that would be the case of, we spoke about a few weeks ago, Amir La'akim, Tzurba Gadol. This is Tzurba Gadol. A guy can even do a daraisa. That would be the best, to have the guy fix it. If it's not possible, it could be that a Jew could do it if it's in a D'Rabbanan way, right? Shvus, b'makam tzarach rabim, being monea, milchshol, me rabim, maybe there is flexibility. Says the Shmir Shabbos, Nikru'u chute ha'eriv ha'makifim mesa'ir. The strings from the Erev ripped. Ha'mishabshin tzuras ha'pesach. Also taltaba. You can't right now. It's usher. You see it. You can't be carrying there. You can tell the Nachri b'Shabbos. If the guy could do just an Rabbanan, then it's a shvus to shvus. That would be better. If he could tie it with a bow, it's a little difficult. Usually they have to be very strong and tight. If you can do a bow, most of the time I don't think you can do a bow. Roll them. What if one of the sticks came out? He could to stick it back in the ground. This is mutter. What if there's no guy? Says the Shmir Shabbos, so a Jew should do a D'Rabbanan, the bow. And don't thread them through. That could be kshira according to the Rambam. Torah, only a D'Rabbanan. So fix it by a guy, and if you need by a Jew. What if you can't fix it? What if you can't fix it? Do you say? Do you tell? So that is a difference in Nag. And the Shmir Shabbos says, better not to say a word. And this is how many poskim quote. If you think that many people aren't going to listen anyway, so then better not to say, mutav sheishogugin. Says the Shmir Shabbos. Im ef shalotakin is the erev b'Shabbos. Mutav shalom ha'achres barabim sha'asal ataltel. Better not to. Avo yodi al kach letznuim. If you know certain people that would listen to you, then you could tell that. They could tell that. There's a diak, he quotes here that according to Ramosha, it could be that you should announce, even if only some people would listen, because he talks about announcing before it's key, it's not to talk. If people are going to talk, should you announce? But some people are going to listen. So here too, it could be that some people are going to listen. But most poskim, he quotes in the footnotes, the Bechaver says most poskim would say not to say anything. It'll make it very difficult for people. And if they're in shul, it'll be difficult not to go home. Okay. What happens if you're in a place without an erev? So you can't carry. We know there's Hotza'ah, Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah, and Dal Amas in Rosh Hashanah. What about clothing? You have to be naked? No, you have to be naked. You can wear clothes. Clothing or batel. And how far do you take that? What about tzitzis? Tzitzis. So tzitzis is a piece of clothing, batel. They use that as one of the answers to the question of Avram, how could the Avos kept the Kol Torah Kula? They weren't Jewish yet, so how they keep Shabbos? A guy is not allowed to keep Shabbos. A Jew has to keep Shabbos. So what do? So one of the answers given, brief, they wore tzitzis without an erev. So for a Jew who's mechuyev in tzitzis, so it's a beged and it's batel. But for a guy who's not mechuyev in tzitzis, it's a matzah, so it's carrying. So it's one of the answers given for what they did about Shabbos. Okay, but the Gemara says in Shabbos, anything that's called a article of clothing or jewelry, an accessory to you, so that's batel, and that's called clothing. Says the Gemara. Tani Gavasi the Rava, source 48. Hamotzi Kela Mukubala Murach Matsefo. If I have a shirt that's folded and it's on my shoulder, that's a problem. V'sadav tabosa biyado, if I'm holding my shoes, chayiv. That's chayiv. But if I'm wearing clothes, mut pater, that's fine. That's pater. Hamotzi Adam Akila Alav. What if I carry a person? So carrying a person we know is an issa d'Rabbanan. Chai nosi as atzmo. He carries himself. What about the person's clothes that he's wearing? That's not called my carrying something that's folded. That's bolted to the person. So if I would have carried them out myself, just by itself, it wouldn't be chayav. But because the person's wearing it, that's why it's only d'Rabbanan like the person. So a clothing that a person is wearing is never subject to a problem of carrying without an heir. But other things are considered a burden. The Gemara says, what if a child is holding a pocketbook, a bag of something? So the Gemara says that's a problem. The Gemara says in Shabbos Kuf Mala, source 49, Hotzi Tinok Chai, V'tis Kis Tali B'Tzavaro. I carry out a baby and he's holding a bag of something in it. That's a problem because the bag is not bottled to the baby. Chai Mishum Kis, says the Gemara, why not? Didn't we learn if you carry a person out in a bed, you're pater on the bed because it's bottled to the person? So the Gemara answers, a bed to a person is different than a bag to a baby. A bed, it serves a person. That's not batel, and therefore it would be not allowed. So it's again a little tricky. Exactly what's batel, what's not batel. The Rambam says if it's a tafshit or it's malbush, one of those two, then it's not a problem. It's not daraisa, right? It's not even d'Rabbanan. Ze'aklau. Kol ha'yotzi v'davar, says the Rambam. She'eino mitafshitav ve'eino derech malbush. If it's not jewelry and it's not clothing, and you carry it normally, how people usually carry it, chayiv. That's an issa daraisa. So what are examples of things that are mutter or things that are usser? Says the Shmira Shabbos. Mutter, anything there to protect you is fine. Mutter lahotzi mirishus l'rishus, kol beged, ubavashi yosil derech levishaso. Any type of beged, as many layers as you need, because if you're cold, beged mashmol kol lovish adam lovishoso, you're wearing it. Ubala hagain al gufo, so it's there to protect him. A jacket, a hat. Oshi yeshba makom mishum tzorach haguf, v'regilo l'lovsho hakol afi hamakom bazman. Well, whatever's considered normal wearing in that locale. Called over she'eno geder malbush, but if it's not clothing, but I need it for some reason, then it can be a tachshit, right? A ring is not clothing, but a woman could wear it out because that's a tachshit. Rav Moshe says that it could be that anything directly on your body is not a problem, but Rav Moshe says, I'm not so sure that I'm going to allow everything. What's he talking about? A watch. A watch. A functional watch, not a jewelry watch. Meaning, if somebody has a gold watch, and he would wear it even if it was not working, that's called jewelry. And therefore you can wear it. That's like any type of jewelry. But if it's a functional watch, just one that tells time, and if it doesn't tell time, I will not wear it. It's useless to me. So says Rav Moshe, really, if that's on my wrist directly, l'chora, it's not a problem. L'chora maker, it's not a problem. He says maybe I tell my Talmidim, Rav Moshe says not to do it because maybe they'll come to wear it on their clothing and then it'll be a problem. But again, that's very unusual. But that's Rav Moshe's nervousness. 52. If it's on the body, then l'chora it is, and therefore it's not a problem. And he skipped down, but still I'm nervous, says Rav Moshe. You can't protest in a place without an erev. Again, if you look at speak about the She'onim in the 1800s, they were talking about little pocket watches that went into the little pocket of the vest. So that's carrying. That's not wearing. So you might come to do that if you have it on your wrist. Rav Moshe says this gzeira, but it's a little difficult to say that. Nobody wears watches on top of their clothing nowadays. That's Rav Moshe's shita. Aruch Shabbos also discusses other lamaisa borderlines between masa and malbush. Mutter, he says, 53. Latzis b'kippah, you can wear a hat, you can wear a yarmulke, a kippah under the hat. That's normal wearing. Mishum suzu derech levisha v'kubelas. That's normal wearing. What about glasses? What about glasses? Says the Aruch Shabbos continuing. If somebody needs glasses to see the kashlo, the rest of the day, you can't see without it. Mutter latzis b'hem. You could go out with them. Vatam, because I need them. They're for me. Misham shalom and I'm wearing them. I'm not carrying them. You can't have glasses in your pocket. You have glasses, what you're wearing. But he says, if you only have reading glasses, meaning even if you put them on, it sounds like, but they're not serving any purpose as you walk. You just need it for reading. You don't need it for walking. So he says then, I don't think it's allowed, unless if they are what's called progressive. Progressive. In the olden days, it used to be called bifocals, but bifocals sound old, so you'd have to call it progressive. My glasses are progressive. What does that mean? It means it's for far and it's for near. That's right. They have in their lens, once they're glasses that are mutter, they're mutter. I need it for seeing the top part of glasses, and therefore this says they're called mishkafei re'iyah. I think that's into watches, and he says what we said before. If I would wear it, even if it stops, that's not just functional. That's jewelry, and it's fine. But if I only wear it for function, then l'chora it cannot be worn where there is no air. If you look at Mishnayos and Shabbos and Gemara there, it seems like women can't wear jewelry. Even though me'ikra din, it's mutter, it's wearing it, but the Gemara talks about that there's a chash that they might come there, they love their jewelry, they'll show it to their friends, and they might walk with it in their hands, daled amos. Right, that's the parak in Shabbos, the sixth parak. Bamet isha yotza, bamet eino yotza. What can a woman go out with? What can't she go out with? That she can't go out with chutei tzemer, chutei bishon, things in her hair. Why most of these things are being worn? He talks about ribbons and other types of jewelry. Why? Because there's a chash, so they might come to take them off. And that's what the Gemara in Shabbos says. If you have a fancy type of woman that would never take off her jewelry, so then it would be mutter. Says the Gemara. 55. Isha chashuva, lo shofa de mafie. The question is, you read the Gemara, you read the Shulchan Aruch, and then you look at, not the Shulchan, you read the Gemara, you look at some of the Mefarshim on the Gemara, but that's not the Minhag Ola. Minhag Ola is to be Mekel. It says Tosfos, already back then. Tosfos says, all of our women wear jewelry. V'anu she'en lanu Rosh Hashanah Gomer, we don't have Rosh Hashanah Daraises. So if most are played down Rosh Hashanah Daraises, even if there's no Erev, to call Rosh Hashanah Shalanu Carmelasi, She'en Mavo Shalanu Rechavos Yud Velvama, Velo Shishim Ribo Bokimbo, right? Tosfos holds that. 600,000. The whole thing is Durabanan anyway. So Durabanan, the women are Mako. Rings and necklaces. It says a continuation that, and even if you average Ram Daraisa, they're going to wear their jewelry. So Mutav Shishogin, better not to tell them. What about two other items? What about gloves? Often, let's say it's cold outside, I'm wearing gloves. Sometimes when you meet somebody, you want to take a Shabbos, you take off your glove and you say Shalom Aleichem to shake their hands. So gloves, maybe it's like the same issue as the jewelry in the days of old. You might come to take them off. So the Aruch HaShabbos says, Minhag Olam is to be Mekel. These are to be Mekel. He quotes, Kfafos he malbush gomor. Really, as is, it's a malbush. It's protecting my hands. I'm not matsuyu. It's common. Sha'ada meisir as a kfafos miyadav. A person removes the kfafos. Lachen yesh be'aposam sha'asru. Let's say it's kfafos. Some say you can't go out. Maybe you come to carry dalad amas. Because of a poskim, sheminag lahakel bazeh. The minhag is lahakel. Ein limchos biyana makilim. The Baal Nefesh can be machmir. But anything that you might come to take off, he talks about slippers. What about sunglasses? That's also a big one. So if they're regular glasses that turn into sunglasses, we spoke about that months ago, that's not a problem of soveya. It's meant to go back and forth. It's not a real soveya, right? That's called derech tashmisho. But here, what if it's just sunglasses? So again, if it's protecting the eyes, you have an issue of refuah, says the Aruch HaShabbos, and you'll never take them off, so then no problem. But often, sometimes if somebody's walking with sunglasses and they go into a shady spot, sometimes they'll take them off. So it says in Aruch HaShabbos, I'm uncomfortable with that. Right? They're going to take them off, so I'm not sure. You're just guarding from the rays of the sun. Don't go out with them because we're worried you're going to take them off in the shady spots. And then what about the clip-ons? In the days of old, I think it was more common. You have clip-ons, so you can take those clip-ons off. He says, I'm not a fan of those. Unless, he says at the end, again, if they're prescription sunglasses, you're going to leave them on. So therefore, I don't think that's going to be a problem. And finally, he talks about, what about carrying a gun on Shabbos? Carrying a gun. So the Shir Shabbos discusses. Most of the people are if you're carrying a gun, that means there's a need. There's a need for our enemies around us to see that we have guns. And even if it's not pikuach nefesh l'faneh, it's pikuach nefesh in general. Poskim look at it, and therefore there would be a heter and maybe even a chiyuv to carry the gun. That's what the Shmir Shabbos says. Mutter la'oed al mishmar, kamo ish mishtara o shmishmar ezrachi. Im achshash lo sakana machayeres hadavar, if there's a danger to take a rifle, v'shar kli neshek, gam im osin al chus le'erev. Right, you need to take it. L'makam shas lo taltelbo. Right, there's danger allowed to take it. You could take, as he says, you could take a flashlight, whatever you need. Right, pikuach nefesh is docha everything. So you can take whatever you need. The Rav Gorin writes based on Aruch HaShulchan that it could be that if somebody always has a gun on them, it's always part of them, so then it's like batel. Even if it's not mamish a danger right now. He quotes, Lafitas Aruch HaShulchan, Im lovish hachayal saneshek al gufo v'ragil b'kach tamid. He never goes anywhere else without it, so it's like part of his clothing. And therefore, even if it's not a hana right in front of you. But again, if somebody is not a chayal, somebody is not doesn't know how to use it, so then it should not be used. Okay, we are up to the last shiur, which again, we'll split up into two. The last shiur in this volume, which is about Erev Chatzeros and Erev Tchumen, but Hashem will pick up with that next time. Okay, we'll stop here.